THEODOR Severin Kittelsen was born one of 8 children in the coastal Norwegian town Kragerø in 1857. His father was a successful merchant and the family were quite well off as a consequence. But he died when THEODOR was still a young boy, leaving his mother and the children in extremely difficult circumstances. So at the age of only 11, THEODOR became an apprentice to a watchmaker in Arendal, and in whatever spare time he had, he drew obsessively from imagination and observation. At the age of 17, Kittelsen's talent for drawing came to the attention of Diederik Maria Aall, a wealthy art historian and patron, who paid for him to enroll at Wilhelm von Hanno's drawing school in Christiania, which we now know as Oslo. And he also had additional tuition at the Norwegian National Academy. Following this, he left Norway for more study at the Munich Academy of Arts, and in 1877, while he was still in Germany, his mother died. In 1879, his patronage came to an end, and consequently he could barely afford to eat or keep a roof over his head, and was obliged to return to Norway. But even so, in 1881 he rented a studio in Christiania where he set about creating paintings and drawings of Norwegian folklore, with an evident fascination for the creatures known as trolls. A year later he was awarded a scholarship to study in Paris, but he wasn't happy there, and in less than a year he had returned to Munich, where he continued to try to make a living. And it was at this time that his luck began to change for the better. A fellow illustrator and friend, Erik Verensold, recommended him to the publishers of a series of folk tales, collected and written by Peter Christian Asjensen and Jørgen Mohr. It was a significantly large assignment, and along with Verensold, Kittelsen illustrated the first 3 volumes of a series titled The Fairy Tale Book for Children. And this project alone kept him occupied with work between 1883 and 1887. He had returned to Munich in late 1883, and despite the fact that the work he was creating was for publication in Norway, he stayed there for the next 4 years. He was simultaneously working on another project, The War Between the Frogs and the Mice, an ancient parody of Homer's Iliad. And for this modern translation, Kittelsen created a series of comical anthropomorphic monochromes. Unfortunately, it failed to find a publisher, and it wasn't actually published until 1928, by which time Kittelsen had died. There was apparently other magazine work in this period too, although I struggled to find anything that could be verified as such. And in 1887 he was also commissioned, along with Erik Verensold and the Swedish illustrator Carl Larsson, to illustrate a Norwegian translation of Niels Gabriel Björklund's Swedish folk tales. He also maintained his status as an artist and exhibited, but only with comparatively limited success. In that year he returned to Norway and moved in with his sister and brother-in-law, who were living in Skonvær lighthouse in the group of islands known as Lofoten. Kittelsen was inspired by the barren but majestic scenery, and among other work created the striking and now widely admired painting Echo in the following year. In the summer of 1889, Kittelsen met Inga Christine Dahl, and they married not long after. In the same year they took up residence in a small house on the island of Skotøy, and a year later Inga gave birth to their first child. He was particularly prolific at this time, and in 1890 he published what could easily have functioned as a decorative calendar, but which was actually published as a book, featuring colour composite illustrations of the months of the year. They were attractively presented juxtapositions of various appropriate elements, some rendered in paint and others in monochrome graphite, making for particularly absorbing compositions. In the same year his collection of pen drawings were published in an edition of Henrik Ibsen's play Peer Gynt. This was a complex assignment with disparate elements and characters woven into the narrative, which was also sprinkled with generous amounts of symbolism and metaphors. But Kittelsen managed to capture and illuminate the play's wildly imaginative story with a collection of densely hatched monochromes of considerable flair. Between 1890 and 91, he published a collection of similarly rendered, humorous images for what may or may not translate as From Life in Small Circumstances. This was published as 2 volumes of drawings which reflected on daily life in Norway. Some were presented in landscape format and others in portrait, but they were all complex scenes which successfully drew in the reader and compelled them to explore the visual content for some considerable time. I found several other images, many of them troll related from this time, but have been unable to find out where, if anywhere, they were published. But as with a large volume of Kittelsen's output, there were many examples of images originally created in monochrome, which were later re-rendered in colour, with other amendments to the visual content, and they were similar but manifestly not simply colourised versions of the originals. From Lofoten was also published in 2 volumes between 1890 and 91, and this project had nothing to do with fiction or humour, but was rather a collection of peaceful if somewhat bleak landscape drawings of this remote Norwegian archipelago. By contrast, in 1891 the Kittelsens bought a house in the considerably less rugged town of Histon, but although they lived there for quite a while, Kittelsen was disdainful of its more bourgeois lifestyle and inhabitants. In that year he also illustrated Matthias Skabrock's collection of humorous stories, with a title which translates as far as I can tell as Truthful Tales. The narrative covered a wide range of subjects from the merely domestic to the outright sinister, and Kittelsen's illustrations reflected that, rendered in monochrome with a combination of his expected scratchy hatching and additional support from washes of grey watercolour. And by now he was creating a greater volume of paintings. Some were landscapes, others more fanciful fantasy, and there was even a solemn self-portrait at this time. Troll Magic, or possibly Witchcraft, take your choice, was published in 1892. Kittelsen both wrote and illustrated this collection of frequently dark and menacing tales of Scandinavian folklore, featuring all manner of grotesque, or at best unsettling creatures, rendered with his sketchily hatched use of pen and ink. In 1893 he had his first solo exhibition in Christiania, which was well attended and well reviewed. Whether he sold much work isn't recorded, but it's known that it was very much his art and more scenic imagery that was on display. The centrepiece of the show was the series of 14 rurally themed images he had created of the island of Jomfruland, also published as a book in that year. And in the following year, Do Animals Have Souls?, an unusual speculative title for a collection of highly accomplished and entertaining line and wash colour illustrations, was published. It contained a large volume of humorous depictions of anthropomorphically rendered small animals. But as superficially good-natured and generally upbeat as these images were, they also contained satirical, less than flattering references to humanity and its various shortcomings and social nuances. But with or without that insight, they were uniformly well evoked and rendered, and another welcome break and relatively light relief, both in terms of subject matter and his more minimal graphic approach from the darker side of Kittelsen's imagination and creative impulse. In the winter of 1896, the family moved to Eggedal and rented a disused farm close to Lake Solivanet. By this point, THEODOR and Inga now had 3 children and a 4th was on the way. Very much at home in this terrain, Kittelsen created several paintings, including one of his better known and most admired works, Goodbye Mother, in 1898. In the spring of 1899 the family had a new house complete with a studio built by the water in Sigdal, and he decorated the house with folktale images and carvings. It was christened Lauvlia, or in English Laurel. From his studio he had a view of the mountain Andersnatten, which became a motif that Kittelsen painted and drew several versions of. In the meantime he had completed work on the book The Black Death, a series of images he'd been working on intermittently for several years. It was finally published in 1900, and it continues to be considered one of his most significant achievements. There were 15 poems and more than 40 black and white hatched ink drawings, and as you might expect from the title, it wasn't the most upbeat or humorous example of his output. The theme was the arrival of the dreaded plague in Norway in the 14th century, and Kittelsen depicted the plague as an old woman called Pesta, who travels from location to location, bringing death to the inhabitants. And it was and is considered to be among his finest work. It can't have been much of a surprise that its relentlessly grim evocations were unlikely to lead to bestseller status. But there were other offerings in the same year, most of which were mercifully brighter and more upbeat. Among them was Askeladden's Adventure, with a collection of painted colour illustrations about a young boy and his various encounters and experiences in the forests of the country. And he also created a series of pictures gathered under the title Tiril Tove, which were forest-themed drawings, and although they did have some more solemn moments in a few of the pictures at least, they paled into simply mild or unsettling status compared to the assault on the viewer that had been the Black Death collection. He also produced a dozen paintings which were purchased by the Norwegian National Gallery, which subsequently collectively became known as the series Soraya Maria Castle, with this example being the best known and most widely admired. They were also published as book illustrations, which brought them to a wider audience and which were quite successful, but not until much later in 1911. To an extent, the early years of the new century were a period largely of consolidation for Kittelsen, with quite a few examples of him returning to earlier monochrome images, now rendered in colour with oils, watercolour and ink. Among these were several compelling new colour interpretations of his Black Death series from 1900. There was some completely new work though, and among other work from this decade he created a large volume of far more basic brush and ink monochromes, which I'm unable to shed any light on regarding what they were created for, or where they were published. And however less prolific he may have been in terms of illustration, he did create quite a few paintings of note during this period too, and I found evidence of some wooden toys, although I couldn't say within any accuracy when they were manufactured or by who. And there are examples of his images being used as decoration on domestic crockery. In 1907 he returned to the Folk Tales series and created another collection of heavily troll-favoured monochromes, and these images did find a larger audience, even if confined to Norway and a few other Nordic countries. In 1908 Kittelsen was appointed a Knight of the Order of St. Olaf, but he was still far from a wealthy man, which wasn't helped by the fact that by this point he and his wife had produced no less than 9 children. He had also been increasingly suffering from neurological illness, and by this point was experiencing increasing stiffness in his fingers. Naturally, his condition had a severe negative impact on his ability to draw, and he became increasingly frustrated and depressed by his physical deterioration. In early 1909, the Kittelsens were forced to sell their beloved house in Lauvlia and move to a rented property where he continued to work but only at a reduced scale. In 1911 he was granted financial assistance from the state, but it was the only equivalent to around £10,000 at today's value. In that year he published his autobiography, but his health and state of mind worsened. He was manifestly depressed and rarely ventured outside, and THEODOR Kittelsen died of unrecorded reasons in 1914 when he was just 56 years old. It's a syndrome that I noticed very early on when making these videos, that where quite a few British and American illustrators, and those from a few other countries such as France and Germany, undoubtedly get the best of what might be called international attention. If I was a betting man, I would certainly put money on not many viewers having previously heard of THEODOR Kittelsen or seen his work. And in all honesty, I only discovered him when I retired and started making videos on the subject. So for me and for you, I'll play us out with more of his fascinating and influential work, and hope as always this makes a bit of a difference.